Emma? Rushanara.
Thank you very much. I've got some questions on value for money and lessons learnt from the PPE procurement and NHS test and trace, but also the collapse of bulb energy, just to give you a bit of a heads up. But before I go on to questions on those topics, I just had a follow-up on the point that Charles Roxburgh, you made earlier about life sciences and infrastructure, and you mentioned that it's not all in the southeast and it's got to be elsewhere, and quite right too, in terms of making sure we have a more balanced economy and investment across the country. But as an MP who represents an area with a life sciences, Bart's Life Sciences programme, I hope that that's not, we're beginning to see a kind of either-or approach. And that's that narrative, not from you, but that narrative I think is dangerous, because London isn't paved with gold everywhere, and there are areas of opportunity with high levels of health inequality. We've seen the impact of the pandemic having big effects in inner city areas, and lots of opportunities for the economy through life sciences investments in areas like mine. So just putting that there for you to be aware, because we have seen that sort of that tension and not a recognition that there's a lot that we can gain as a country from by not neglecting to invest in areas that are legitimate areas for investment. So I just wondered if you had any assurances you can give me on that.
Yes, the Prime Minister has always said it's not about levelling down, it's about levelling up. But in a context where, to take the R&D budget, where with such a significant increase in the R&D budget, it is possible to be investing at a sort of faster rate outside London and the South East, while still increasing our public investment in R&D behind some of our real centres of excellence, whether it's Oxford, Cambridge, or, as you say, London is a huge centre of excellence for R&D. So I think that is true. The other thing we are doing is trying to catalyse more private sector investment, both by industrial investors in science and R&D, but also in investors in the businesses that spin out of them. And London has an incredibly rich set of financial investors that can support companies that spin out, and that we're seeing that in a whole range of sectors, the startup success stories in technology and life sciences in London as well. So, as I say, if we had a flat budget for investing in life sciences in general across R&D, if we had a flat budget, this would be a much, much tougher position. But as we have an significant increase in that budget, it should be possible to avoid these, what I say, are false choices, and would be
I'll send you the demand list in that case. Thank you very much. Yes. That's a reassuring answer. On to value for money questions. The NAO report last year on government procurement during the pandemic, and correspondence that we received from the Treasury, showed that it still retains some involvement in procurement of PPE. It held assurance meetings to provide challenge and scrutiny to the programme, and also participated in oversight committee meetings chaired by the Department for Health and Social Care. Did you find any areas for improvement in the working arrangements and the assurance meetings? And what, if anything should be done differently? Obviously, you're very familiar with the context of controversies. Earlier this year, a figure of about 2 billion was set out as being spent in contracts to those with connections to Conservative Party donors. More recently, there's a report of 47 awarded contracts for PPE totalling £4.7 billion after referrals from politicians and officials, according to recent analysis. So I just wondered what, given what we've seen, lessons have been learnt.
Thank you. We've certainly been looking at the issues and, as Charles said earlier, learning the lessons as we go. I'll turn in a moment to Kat, who's been the person overseeing that, but the early lessons were set out in a letter to this committee from the Chief Secretary the previous Chief Secretary, I should say, earlier this year, and in particular looking at PPE, as he said, we felt that we could have done better with better information sharing at an early stage, with greater internal within government challenge. The commercial specialists in the Cabinet Office, I think, played a valuable role, but greater upfront external scrutiny from them would have helped, as would have been a more collective effort from the beginning, embedding experts into the spending teams. Clearly, we've looked very carefully at the NEO reports, and Captain Shaw wants to say something about that.
Just on that, can I just check something? There are still contracts being awarded through the emergency legislation arrangements, not as much. Are some of those checks and balances in place then? There's sort of some of those lessons that the Chief Secretary was talking about.
Kat, perhaps I can turn to you at this point, who's been overseeing this.
Sure.
The simple answer is yes. And in fact, this morning I was going through with my team all of the lessons learned and making sure that we were applying it to the latest judgments that we're taking on the new variant. One of the Chief Secretary's recommendations was that the Cabinet Office and Treasury officials, as well as functional experts from the commercial function, were embedded within governance and decision making. And I can confirm that that has been the case throughout the whole of this year, and as part of the monthly discussions that we have on PPE, on vaccines and on test and trace, the Treasury, Cabinet Office and commercial officials are embedded within decision making.
Thank you very much. Just on a further question, the Treasury have told us that they decided not to have a Treasury approval process for new spending in PPE, but instead to have assurance meetings, as we've just talked about, to provide challenge for spending. Was that a mistake? And are we, if I just so that I've heard this correctly, are we continuing to do assurance meetings, or are we going to move towards a Treasury approval process?
Could I perhaps start by just clarifying what we've done? As you know, Treasury consent and the approval to spend is a critical core function of the Treasury and my team, so it is not the case that no approval has taken place. If we take ourselves back to March 2020, it became clear very, very quickly that we would need to use the full flexibilities of the spending control framework, and we needed to operate with pace given the uncertainty and risks involved. And so the decision that we took was that as part of our approvals, we would move faster to take decisions to approve funding up front, but to put much more emphasis on the post-event spend procurement assurance processes. So there was an approval process for PPE, for test and trace and for vaccines. To give you a sense of the lessons learned and how we discharged that assurance process, for example, for PPE, right up front, we set an envelope of £100 million. That very quickly escalated by June up to 13.8 billion. But as part of the original conditions that we sent to the Department of Health, we put in place conditions on quality assurance, existence of stock, involvement of commercial teams, unit costing ranges, and we sent very specific requests for the way in which the accounting officer approved the delegation.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I just check, because I think it links to some earlier questions. But before I go on to that, how much awareness did you have of the fast track programme in PPE equipment, where the cross-government PPE team established a high priority lane to assess the process for potential PPE leads, and the subject of, what has become the subject of controversy and, frankly, brought a number of things that have been going on into disrepute. Britain has a pretty good record of being clean in how our contracts are allocated, awarded, but the recent scandals have had a hit on the reputation of how our government works and how contracting happens. How much awareness for all of you was there in the Treasury?
So firstly, to say the delegated envelope that was provided to the Department of Health of 13.8 billion meant that we were giving greater authority and delegated spend authority to the accounting officer in the Department of Health, and therefore it is up to the accounting officer locally to ensure that they are following all of the spending requirements in managing public
Were
money,
you
which,
aware?
as you say,
Were any of you
includes
aware?
propriety.
Were any of you aware at the time of this going on? Over £13 billion is a lot of public money, and one would think that if stuff was being delegated, then you would want to know more about these special sort of fast track programs.
So at the time, we were not aware that this was a process that the Department of Health were undertaking. As always, we're very grateful to the National Audit Office's review into this, and it's given us some really interesting conclusions, which we're currently following up with the Department of Health and the Cabinet Office commercial team.
Thank you. Permanent secretaries, were you aware? Were there any alarm bells going off at the time? Over the period because reports were coming out about this. I mean, at what point were you aware of this fast track programme?
I don't remember it at all. The people that would have been, if any had been, would have been the health spending team. And as Kat says, it wasn't part of. Well, I've got nothing to add on that to what Kat said.
Order. Sorry, Rushanara. So the division bell has just sounded, and I believe there might be multiple divisions at the end of this, as we've reached the end of a group. So I'm going to suspend the committee. If it's only one division, it'll just be about 15 minutes. If it's more, then bear with us, it might be a little longer. But if I can ask our witnesses to stay with us, and we'll come back to you very shortly. Thank you very much. Thank you. Order.
Currently suspended. The proceeding is 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 currently suspended.
Well, hello, and we're back from our divisions, so apologies to those who are watching us on Parliament TV that we've had a slight break there for two divisions of the House. And Rushanara, I think you were mid-flow with your questions.
Thank you, Chair. So I was just talking about the contracts that were awarded during the pandemic and what lessons, in light of recognising that it was a challenging period, what lessons can be drawn from that to make sure that we don't have the spectre of abuses of power, frankly, where if it is the case, it's billions of pounds of contracts being awarded to those with connections that are political, it raises concerns about trust and also the integrity of how contracts are done. And you were saying to me that the Department for Health and Social Care was ultimately responsible for, once the money was allocated, for the oversight. Do you think that we need to fundamentally rethink that oversight? Treasury historically has got an excellent reputation of following the money and making sure that money is spent correctly and there's value for money.
Thank you. Well, there are two different areas of control here. There's the approvals. There's the approval of expenditure, and then for which the Treasury is responsible for allocating money and approving it. And on that, as we've said, and as the Chief Secretary said in his letter, it was a deliberate decision to give a much greater delegated authority to spend in the interest of speed. Then secondly, there's the oversight of contracts, which is a Cabinet Office responsibility. They have their own separate control regime. That, I think, is in particular the area that we've been, or principally they've been working through. We've already identified a lesson which I alluded to earlier, which is the need for greater and earlier within government scrutiny from the Cabinet Office commercial specialists onto whichever department it is. But I think Kat was about to talk about some of that was an earlier lesson, some of the further lessons since then, including in the light of more recent NEO reports. Yeah.
So, Kat, what can we expect now going forward if we had to respond in a similarly, dramatic way that would avoid this sort of thing happening?
So our spending control framework is built on best practice from a three-line of defence model, and so it relies on the department functions in the Cabinet Office and the Treasury in the second line, and then our independent assurers through the NEO and the Government Internal Audit Agency also playing their part. And so the thing that we're continuously trying to do is to make sure that these three lines of defence are operating as effectively as possible. I think just on the very specific question you had about procurement, in the break I did just go back and take the opportunity to reread very specifically some of the issues there and what the Department of Health has done about it. And one of the very specific recommendations was that there wasn't enough of an audit trail or documentation of the way in which the priority procurement process had been undertaken, and the accounting officer of the Department of Health has set out what he will be doing in future to change that. And of course, the Treasury's responsibility through the Treasury minute process is to make sure that we hold the accounting officer to account. So your point about us taking this very seriously and following through is obviously an important part of what we do. More broadly, we have done quite a lot of lessons learned activity with the Cabinet Office on wider assurance and controls. So we've looked at the role of functions, we've looked at the accounting officer responsibilities and how effectively they operated during COVID. The finance leadership group, which I chair, has looked at forecasting, demand modelling, and to go back to the point made earlier about fraud, we've done some specific work there. So I'd like to think that this is part of a continuous improvement exercise, so just, rather than specifics.
That's really helpful, thank you. So can we be confident that those things that you've done now would, and the line of sight you have in terms of procurement, as you pointed out, Cabinet Office plus Department for Health, in future it might be some other department, that we're not going to have a situation where billions of pounds of contracts are awarded and there are quite big question marks around whether they should have been awarded in that way and waste of public money in certain circumstances. Can we be confident that you've got everything that can be done in real time rather than after the event? Because obviously there are investigations and reports and audits that can happen afterwards, which, if the money's gone, it's a bit difficult to go and get it back if it's gone to dodgy contractors who can't deliver value for money.
So I can assure you that we've learnt the lessons as quickly as we can. I don't think we can give a kind of cast iron guarantee this will never happen again. Propriety risk and commercial risk for the scale of procurement that we undertake in government is obviously significant.
Okay. So Tom?
But I am assured by the actions that the Cabinet Office have taken.
So Tom?
Just to add to that, I think the main issue here was that was the question of speed.
Yep.
The government identified the need to move very quickly, and in order to enable that to happen, as we set out, the approval process was streamlined. So that simply meant
that.
So
we're all sympathetic to that, but there was a clear pathway that was created, and this is subject of a number of court cases and controversies, and it links to the earlier questions about whether, frankly, are civil servants empowered enough? Is Sir Humphrey empowered enough to speak truth to power? I'm not talking about your department in this case, although your department is connected because you're the holder of the public purse. You're ultimately responsible. To ministers to say this is not on. This is actually going to cause problems. And should the Department for Health officials and cabinet officials be more empowered to speak up to ministers or those who set up this special pathway for contracts? Because it seems like that's where there's been a breakdown, and there's a lack of confidence in the civil service, which is deeply problematic, because actually civil servants are there to protect the public purse. You're there as long, there's the continuity element that's really important, and we depend on a strong, confident civil service to speak truth to power. And it seems like it hasn't happened in this case.
As you've said, there are investigations, inquiries and legal action going on, so I can't comment on the specifics of the case, given all of that. As Kat said, we've learnt lessons, tightened up the system so that will improve the position in the future. It's always going to be the case, though, that if you basically streamline procedures, drop various steps, drop the level of scrutiny, then you are increasing the risk of ultimately errors of some sort. So that remains the case. But subject to that, as Kat said, we think we've tightened it up as far as we can.
Thank you very much. Just onto the collapse of Bulb Energy. The government's reported to have set aside 1.7 billion for loans to cover the cost of running Bulb Energy through a special administrator this winter after the supplies collapse. Are these additional funds to be approved in the supplementary estimate, and how much of it does the Treasury expect to be repaid, and by when?
I'm happy to take that. Well, obviously we're facing a very challenging and unprecedented situation in the energy supply market, given the five-fold increase in wholesale gas prices.
Yep.
And as a result, 27 supply companies have gone out of business. The Ofgem, the regulator, and the Department of Business and Energy are leading on this. We're very closely involved. Their recommendation was that the right way to handle the difficulties at Bulb was through a special administration regime. The other suppliers had been handled through a different mechanism called supply of last resort. And in order to ensure continuity of supply, which is a critical consideration here, we needed to make a 1.7 billion loan facility available to cover the administrator's needs on that. That will be for a 6-month period. It's a contingency facility. It gives confidence and enables the administrator to protect supply and keep costs down and look for an appropriate exit strategy. We don't know how much of that will be used. It will depend on the final cost of the administration, which at this stage we don't know. The administrator is required to do the administration at lowest cost possible, but we're not going to make any estimates of how much we'll need.
What about repayment? Would it be repaid if it's used?
Well, it's a decision for the Secretary of State for Business as to how to secure repayment. He has the powers to impose a levy on the industry in order to get repayment. The terms and conditions of that will be decided in course. But we don't yet know the scale of that until the administration has run its course.
Now, is the Treasury expecting or anticipating the need for funding others in the future that might find themselves in difficulty? As you mentioned already, many have found themselves in difficulty. And if so, what are the additional amounts likely to be required, and has the government set aside enough contingency funding for this purpose?
Well, this is a fast-moving situation, and it would be quite wrong to speculate on the financial viability of remaining companies.
You stand ready to provide contingency support if necessary. I mean, that's what our constituents will want to know, that if their energy company is in trouble, that the government or somebody is going to step in to fix it.
What is absolutely clear is that the regulator, the relevant government departments, the Treasury, stand ready to ensure continuity of supply, which is absolutely critical at any time, but particularly through the winter. And to date, with 27 companies having been transferred to other suppliers and Bulb now in a special administration regime, the government has delivered on that. And there's a lot of work, a lot of coordination and close working together with our regulator on how to navigate the rest of this challenge.
Thank you. That's really helpful. But you'll appreciate there's been a lot of anxiety about, given the stories about the issues that energy companies have faced. Just one last question, perhaps for Sir Tom. There was a rather unseemly row, it seems, between Treasury and BIS a while back in terms of what kind of public funding or support would be provided. And I just remember listening to it thinking people are worried about whether their energy company is going to go bust, and the Treasury is putting out statements saying the BIS secretaries, got it wrong and so on. And can we expect a bit more kind of maturity in the way that government departments and ministers behave when it comes to these issues, so that they're focused, as you've described now? There's much more coordination, that they can get to coordination rather than departmental spats, where the reports are that the Prime Minister and Downing Street had to step in and kind of arbitrate.
Thank you. There was, as you say, a certain amount of noise in the press. I don't remember the precise details of it now, but the main focus of the government, as Charles has said, is to guarantee security of supply to households in the short term, then resolve the problems facing the companies in the medium term, and then no doubt learn the lessons as to the underlying cause of the situation.
Thank you.